All right. Welcome to the Social Media Church podcast. My name's Aaron, and I am one of your co-hosts, not joined by the other co-host, Nils Smith. But I am really excited to be recording this podcast that, to be honest, is long overdue. I'm even trying to figure out how to open this up because this is a meaningful moment for me. Before I say his name, I'm going to give a little backstory. I grew up in the church with a distance with myself from the church. Football sat in the middle of myself and Jesus in the church. But this man walked beside me my whole life since high school, at least. And at the end of my college career, when I wasn't sure what I was going to do, I did not go to school to get into ministry. He invited me into ministry. And so the reason that I'm sitting here interviewing him now today and giving practical tips to you guys as you clunk your way through social media and figure out what this new world looks like and digital evangelism, it is because of this man right here. And I'm just really excited to interview him today. This is long overdue. This guy's name is James Carmichael. Reverend. Is it Reverend? Pastor? I think you put Reverend on your little
yes, it is.
Yes, Reverend James Carmichael. Really excited to have James. And I also want to say this: my first week. So James invited me into ministry, the Grove Church in Albany, Oregon. I was there for 5 years, my first 5 years of ministry. And within the first week of my ministry at the Grove, I found this podcast, the Social Media Church podcast. His wife, Heather, who is also on staff at the Grove, literally Googled social media church and this podcast popped up. I also, a fun fact, one of our listeners messaged me on Facebook the other day and let me know that he was looking for help in this area and Googled the same thing and found this podcast. So what was true 7 years ago, 8 years ago is still true today. So James, welcome to the podcast. I'd just love for you to introduce yourself and a little bit about your context and what you do in Albany.
Thanks, Aaron. The key phrase in all of this is to remember that nobody knows what they're doing. Yes. So we're all Googling stuff.
That's right.
Yeah. Yes. I'm this lead pastor, the founding pastor of the Grove here in Albany, Oregon, and we are an hour south of Portland, if people are familiar, or 4 hours north of California, if that is your only reference point. But I have two kids in high school, a senior and a freshman, and they're both doing school from home. And my wife is also in ministry and works for the church. She does worship and like our social justice initiatives and those kinds of activities that we do in our community. But it's awesome to be here. I'm a listener and now I'm on it.
Yes, which is what we want, more and more. And I say this is long overdue because a lot of our listeners start out like where I was and where the Grove was, and in a lot of ways still is, not having all of the resources to spend all of the time researching, practicing, fidgeting around with these different facets of social media. And so there are some of us that are resourced within the church that have a little bit of that extra bandwidth to search in these areas and then bring helpful conversations back. And so, but because that's a lot of our listeners think that the only way to do this, and this was definitely a season in my ministry, the only way to do this well or to do this at all is to be able to hire an online pastor, or which we just came out with a podcast on why you shouldn't hire an online pastor, or that you have to have X number of dollars in your budget to be able to do this. And so I really want to celebrate and highlight what the Grove and what the church and what James through his leadership has been able to do in this season of the pandemic. So I just want to open it up because James's church is not, I don't want to call it under-resourced, but it is much more attainable and much more easily to relate to than an Elevation or a Life Church or a Transformation Church or a Hillsong. It looks a lot more like you and I. And so I love hearing from James that innovation can still happen in the church. The role and the mission that God has called smaller local churches to play within their cities is just as attainable. using digital strategies, which we've all had to adapt to in this season. So James, you kind of want to let everybody know maybe a little bit about the context pre-coronavirus, during coronavirus, and then we'll get into kind of where we're going from there.
Yeah, 100%. So we were meeting in a school cafeteria, and the school cafeteria had like the worst internet in the world, right? It's like a dead spot in our town. It's known. My calls drop there all the time. So we ended up buying our own like rocket pack so we could have our own Verizon signal to try to get something. And we started streaming. And all we did was set up a camera. We bought a box to keep a camera in, set it up, and press play, and had a computer there. Like it was the microphone on the camera, you know? But that kind of, for us, the reason behind that for us is that innovation is one of our core values. And that had, like, we have never strayed from that. We're always trying to see what would happen if we did this. But part of that innovation means that we have to have freedom as one of our values. And so I didn't have anything to do with this. Like instead, there were young people in our church who were very interested in this and very passionate about it. And I just gave it to them and let them run with it, right? And so was it like excellent or something I'd write home about? Probably not. The sound quality is wacky and the screen was whatever, you know?
Right.
But everybody that was away from church in our church family, if they were camping during the summer or something like that, groups were turning it on their TVs while they're camping because they wanted to have community. They didn't want to have a killer video experience, you know? And so from that's kind of what led into our thoughts as we began the pandemic. We weren't looking for how can we have the most killer video experience. And so when the pandemic hit, we actually were kicked out of the school, obviously, because everyone was. Yes. And so we moved into the double wide garage behind my house and we painted it for a couple of weeks so it looked less dungeony on TV. We bought lights on like Home Depot, we had to order them. And so we just hung these lights up and we had like 5 people, all social distance inside of there and stuff. And it was insane, you know, but we ran a long wire from the computer to my home modem, unplugged everything else so that we could run it through because anything else would start making it sketchy.
Yes.
And we just kind of ran with it. And we bought a switch. So we'd had 2 cameras and we thought that we were the most innovative thing in the world, you know? And then, but we really were not trying to be, we weren't trying to compete. That doesn't make any sense because like you mentioned, Elevation, Hillsong, those churches are outstanding and their role is a lot broader, global-ish than ours is. We are the Grove Church in Albany, Oregon, you know, and so
not Albany, New York,
yeah,
Albany, Oregon, yeah.
And I don't think one's better than the other. It's just different roles, and we don't compete and we don't try to measure ourselves against that, you know. But we are, because we're creating a community. And that's really what we saw. So we really actually started by focusing on the comment section. We weren't looking at hits and likes and all that kind of stuff, or how many people happen to watch this for 3 seconds, you know, and we just kind of were like, how can we help people feel less alone? Because I think that's a secondary pandemic that's happening in our culture, you know?
That's right. Yes, so, the loneliness. Yeah, that's great. And I think just staying on this competition spot for a second, I've really started, actually, I've felt this for a long time, but vocalizing it more, is the internet and online is way too big a space to be competitive. And frankly, even the physical world, it's way too big of a space for one church, one pastor, even the top 10, the top 50. It takes all of us, and particularly in a digital space, like YouTube, where there is endless amounts of content. We need as much gospel on there as possible. And we could literally all be saying the same thing. And in a very strange way, we are. It's a very simple message, and it's the hope of Jesus. I'm
not even interested in local physically local competition. There's so many non-Christians within 10 miles of our church.
Of course.
We need 5 more churches next door.
That's right. And all those pastors, some people want to hear it from James, some people want to hear it from the pastor down the street. And you could be saying the same thing, but it's that community piece. And that is what the church has always had to offer, that we come alongside people. So innovation. So you started putting value on the comment section. You started putting your services out there. What kind of, we've been in it a year now, and just now in California, it's early March 2021. We're just now, I think Disneyland actually today announced that at the end of April, they're going to start being open again. Yeah. So I'm curious, we've been in it for about a year. What kind of happened as you really dove into the only way to do community in this season, which was online?
Yeah. So there was a lot of, we started doing, besides streaming Sunday morning, we started right away doing, we call them lunchtime live. And so every day at noonish, we hop online 5-10 minutes, just some kind of encouragement, maybe like this week I'm doing Woman in the Bible for a Women's Week, and then we started doing some conversations as well. And then we started doing like Tuesday nights with James, and we did that all through the summer. And we noticed that during the summertime, especially last year, there was still a lot of high energy. People hadn't gone back into school, and like the drag of the pandemic hadn't hit people yet. So there was still a lot of engagement. So we were really loading in for having discussions that people, like discipleship discussions, where people would grow in their faith, which we've got feedback on that was successful, but also doing that in a public square where someone could hop in and hear a reasonable explanation about different facets of Christianity, where they might be watching TV at home. They know me because our kids play sports together, and they hop on to Facebook. I pop up. I wonder what this guy's talking about, So I tried to talk in ways that would explain it, explain the different things that we were talking about, so that if someone was watching for 5 minutes, they could catch it, And so some topics were not appropriate for online, but there was a lot of opportunity there for us to develop those conversations. We actually had a person jump in. Eventually we started having like a team in the comment section on Sunday morning, right? Like a greeter team, and we actually had someone jump in that I knew from years ago who during the pandemic had recommitted their life to Jesus because of lunchtime lives. And here I'm thinking they're the least effective thing in the world, right? I'm just like, I'm doing these silly 5-minute things, and it's not, a lot of churches do this and they're polished, right? And mine was the least polished in the world. I had an idea of what I want to talk about, and then I would just talk about how I'm feeling, and just talk to people in the comments and say, oh, it's so cool to see you and stuff. And so we've actually seen people like transformed by the community that's built, and just by the content that we created. And the funny thing of me saying that is I'm the last guy who wants to be like, we need more content, we need more, you know what I mean? Like I'm a regular dude, but we've done something, and instead of trying to be the most polished, we try to be authentic and create community, let people into our hearts, and they've invited us into theirs. And more importantly, people have invited Jesus into their heart, way more importantly.
Which is why we're doing any of this, creating the quote unquote content. I am curious, James, because one of the things that I've loved seeing is I know that there was a lot of things that you empowered me to do because they were less interesting to you, and probably at a certain core level, they weren't. This is riskier to say, but they weren't worth your time, or maybe you were under the impression that there was time better spent doing something else, maybe having coffee with somebody, or whatever that may have been. So I'm curious, to a leader, I don't think that we need to convince people anymore that community can be built online, but maybe as the world starts to open back up, what would you say to somebody that maybe is still wrestling with, gosh, I feel like me putting more of myself in a digital space, maybe someone that wrestles, that almost feels like content is a swear word, as you were saying it, what would you say to them, having gone through that journey yourself and seeing how God has used you, not just on the stage in person on a Sunday morning in a middle school, but in that Facebook public square, as you described it?
Yeah. So one of the things I think that's actually subversive is our use of social media. The implicit goals in social media is viral clips, right? And I do that sometimes. I put up funny stuff and I'm like, oh, it's just purely funny stuff, right? That I hope people share with other people, bring some joy and stuff like that. But what we're trying to do that's subversive is not go viral. We're trying to create community among a specific group of people. And so when we, when we're developing our strategy for that, it really is like, I'm going to jump all the way back to where you're talking about like using my time and stuff like that. It's so important that we don't create just a relationship with James, but a relationship within the community of the church. And so there's a level of engagement where people are commenting back about what James is talking about. And then there's a secondary level of engagement where they're commenting to each other in the comment section, right? To the point that when we started having some outdoor gatherings in the summer, there were people who were there in person who were on their phones because they wanted to be able to engage in the chat. Right? Like,
that is fantastic. That goes back to an episode we recorded with Nick Ovalle called Second Screen, where people are literally watching together, but they're more interested in interacting while they're watching on their second screen, which is the phone. That's very cool.
Yeah. And we told them they're kind of like a studio audience. What we were doing was still for an online audience. Like I preached to the camera,
that right. Just, can you, I need to stay there for a second, because there's churches with all the resources in the world that do not understand what you just said. And I'm curious, this is going to naturally speed the conversation up, because I'm curious when it is okay. Well, I'm skipping a big part that we want to celebrate on this podcast as well. But can we just spend a little bit more time talking about what you said about how, even though there was people there, you still decided, and you preemptively did the work of letting them know this is still for the people on the other side of the lens. Why did you make that decision? And how are you going to implement that going forward?
Yeah, this is a hard one, because when I've noticed a lot of churches at this point in our area are doing is an implicit prioritization of in-person, where they're saying, we have these 2 in-person services, and we have this one that's online, and the one that's online, frankly, isn't as good, right? Like maybe they have a full band for in-person, but online it's just a guitar player and a preach, that kind of thing. And what that is content. And what we were, in my evaluation, and what we were trying to do is create community. And at that time in the pandemic, there was still a lot of people for whom it wasn't safe to gather together. And so we wanted to create that experience. The advantage of being together is being able to sing to each other. Theologically, we're actually instructed in the New Testament to sing to one another, right? And there's an encouragement in our souls from singing to one another. That's undeniable, right? And you don't get that online, right? But when we were together, we let them know, and we communicated that this is the design of what's going on, because we're trying to take care of the most vulnerable. And as a church, that's what it is to be loving, right? So even now, as we have a limited in-person audience right now, but what we've done is merge together the online and the in-person experience, to the point where like we've experimented with this and made changes even in the last month since we've been doing this, but we do like a welcome to church element, right? I call it the LJ and Aaron show, because it's Aaron, the new Aaron at our church, and
Aaron,
my son
Aaron
LJ.
Me got replaced by another Aaron.
A new Aaron,
yeah. There you go.
So they do a little recorded bit, and we actually play that online, but we play it in person as well. So people watching a video screen getting the same experience. And that takes some coordination, obviously, but our tech people have the freedom to create that. I said, it was their idea, and I was like, if you can pull this off, pull it off. And then we tried other things, and it didn't work as well. So we nixed that stuff, and we just experiment with it. And we give them, like I said, that freedom to do that. But even in person now, then I was like preaching directly face on with the camera, and they just happen to be there. Now I'm treating the gathered people as one part of the audience. And so I know where the camera is, and I intentionally spend time staring into the camera. I have conversations with the camera operator about how to film it so that it feels more engaged, and so does the people that are in charge of that, like it's not me
Right.
I'm not the expert, but
yes.
So that's kind of where we're at, is we're trying to create the feeling for people of community, and
Yes.
that, and we've actually noticed that one of the things people talk about, because we're a smaller church where people know each other,
Yes.
and so they are trying to guess who they see silhouetted in the audience.
That's
because
funny.
they want to be together.
Totally.
You know? So it's like we try to create that a little more.
But it's all engagement and it's all community, and you're just fully leaning into that exactly where you are at the size that you are, not number chasing, not anything like that, but really creating that experience where anybody in the community would feel comfortable checking that out, and frankly would have the opportunity to check it out because they might not be knocking on your door. And that's not a COVID thing. That's been a long time thing of, I'd rather not go to a church because that's risky. I'd rather see it somewhere else first.
Without a doubt.
And so, but you guys are meeting again in person, and you have the luxury of doing that because you have to be the only church in the whole coronavirus season that has bought a building. You guys bought a building, and that is worth celebrating. So I am curious. I want to celebrate that, but I'm also, why did you buy a building?
This is insane, isn't it? We've been exploring things as a church. We're 11 or 12 years old now as a church, and we've always met in the same middle school for 10 or 11 years. I guess 10 and a half years before the pandemic hit. We took a couple summers off when they were doing construction and stuff like that, met in the Boys and Girls Club, met outdoors, but which is risky in Oregon. So we actually, a theater down, we actually almost did a church merger the year before, and it didn't go through with one of the smaller congregations in our denomination. And then this building came up for sale, and we put an offer in it. Without going into details, there's a series of miracles that you can track through where you're like, well, how did this happen? You know? And so we ended up buying a historic theater downtown in Albany, where everybody knows where it is. If you grew up here, you went. Well, here's the funny thing: if you grew up here, younger than like 20 years old, you went there.
Yes.
But in the last 15 years, a church has owned it, and it stopped being a cultural center. So young teenagers today don't have an experience of going into this building, and they're the first generation since 1913 that hasn't gone to this building for movies and shows and stuff like that. And so our church has a dream of bringing like people into that building for the services, but also to be a participator in our community. So we're trying to rebuild that kind of art scene and be a part of rebuilding that art scene in our community. But we bought a building, and who does that? That's ridiculous.
Yes.
Without a doubt. We've said that we think God is on mission to make fun of us.
Yes. For sure.
But we ended up, so we switched. We were outside in the summer. This is what's amazing. We did our garage in the back. We switched to outside. Then we switched to what we called the studio, which was really an unheated upstairs of a barn. We called it the studio. And then it started getting so cold in the studio right before, like we were trying to heat it, and it's next to impossible. And then, which, in a barn, obviously. And then we had in-person Christmas Eve services at our building, and it's insane.
Yes. So in person, and you have a building now. And so now it kind of lends itself, like there's a whole strategy that's going around. I've watched some of the Instagram videos. You guys are renovating it a little bit and doing these things. So, but moving forward, now that there's this new tapped understanding of how community, and you've spent a whole year investing in how to do this online, what, with the limited scope, I liked how you put that. There's some churches that have a broad scope because they have broad resources. With a church that has to pick and choose the ministry impact that they want to have, how are you going to implement online, this mixture of a brand new building as well as online? I'm assuming this question, I haven't asked you this yet. I'm assuming that the answer is we're just going to drop online. I'm assuming it's not that. Maybe it is, which would make for a really great podcast. And the listeners may never hear it, but I'm assuming that it's not that. because I think we're entering into a brand new season. Like the world has been fundamentally changed. And I think God has been teaching a lot of church leaders that there's another way to do ministry that can make what they were doing before amplified, which is ultimately the goal of this podcast, to help you amplify your ministry online using social media and everything else that comes along with it. How is the Grove, and this is probably how we'll kind of wrap this up, going to continue celebrating a brand new building, so celebrating the physical expression of the church together while also continuing to minister online?
Yeah, part of what informs me in this area is there was an interview that are we allowed to name drop here, that I heard from Rick Warren, who I once was on a conference call with, so we're basically friends. But he talked about how a lot of churches, their main goal was to get back in person, because that was their only purpose in existence, is gathering as this group. And our church has intentionally taken weeks off, like had no church or done service projects. A lot of churches are doing this now, but where we've just been like, hey, we're shut down because this isn't who we are, just gathering together. And so we have other purposes that exist, right? So for us, success isn't being together in a room or even being together to broadcast online. Success is when we are missionally being the body of Christ in our community, in our relationships, in our workplace, in our families, right? In our schools. And so when we are gathering back together, we're actually, it's almost like embarrassing for churches that have had buildings and full access to the internet that they weren't doing anything. And it just, to me, it's like there are thousands of people. I drive to church on Sunday mornings and there's people jogging, there's people riding their bikes, there's people walking the stroller and the dog with no guilt, no sense of what would a person be doing on a Sunday morning. They have 2 days off. And so when those people are sitting on their couch at home, they aren't going to think, you know what I should do, get up and drive to a random building where people dress weird and they sing songs like karaoke songs I don't know. Right? They're like, that's not thinking, but they are scrolling Facebook, they are scrolling Instagram. So what if we created a community space there? And so we've continued to develop that. And we have part of our design and our remodeling is having recording spaces, right? And probably not, we don't have a big enough building to have like a recording studio, but when we build our spaces, how do we make sure that that's a usable space for this thing, right? And how do we use this corner to film videos, and how do we do those kinds of things? Plus, we're going to permanently wire in cameras where now, if for anyone, if we're doing an event, we're ready for it. If another organization rents our space, we're ready for it. Those kinds of things, right? So that we can play a part in that. So we're not going to ever play the game where we're trying to, well, I'm not saying, we don't feel called at this point to play the game where we're trying to increase our views or increase our reach. We have people from, we've had people from Belize, people from Puerto Rico, people from Canada checking out our stream. But all three are relationally connected. Right? We have friends there and family members there. And so that's really what we're trying to do is create a space that people feel like they can invite their friends to, and honor people's relationships that way. So that's the same thing for online for us. And it's not just going to be streaming. People in our church have already said, hey, when pandemic's over, can we keep doing lunchtime live? Because it just gives me a recentering and a connection point in the middle of the day. And you can imagine if you work in a completely unbelieving space where you feel like you're the only believer there. And I know in a lot of parts of the country that might not be true for people, but up here in the Pacific Northwest, that's true all the time. And so you're there all day with no other believers. It can feel pretty isolated.
That's right.
And then we have this lunchtime live where other people are commenting and you're having a conversation. It's uplifting, you know.
So you'll continue to do lunchtime lives.
We will. So
that's awesome.
It's really been weird though, because I have lunch appointments now because that's when people aren't working. So I've either been late or I've missed them or I'm doing 10 minutes early, but I have one guy I meet with and we meet at 12:10. I'm like, that's when I'm
I have
available.
to do this 5-minute, 10-minute thing first before we meet. That's great. Well, James, I thank you for, first and foremost, for getting me into ministry. I can't celebrate this enough that you raised somebody who wasn't even going to enter this game. You got them into the game, and then you got them promoted to, I don't even like using the word promoted. You founded God found a whole nother seat because I had a completely different view on what my life could be. So I want to thank you publicly for that. Thank you for your time sharing and encouraging church leaders who are still, this is what I can't say enough. Nobody's figured this out. Like nobody is, if somebody's ahead, it's by a few steps. It's not by people who have been doing this for 10, 15 years. I mean, I think about conversations I've had with Jay Cranda, a previous host of this podcast. He's been doing this at Saddleback with Rick Warren. He probably didn't just hop on a conference call with Rick Warren like you and I have. But Jay has been doing this for 15 years, and there's things that he and Saddleback are refiguring out in this season. And so it just can't express enough that nobody's ahead in this. It takes all of us to continue to have these conversations and figure it out. So James, I thank you for sharing your context. I know that it's encouraging for a handful, if not all of our listeners who are in a very similar context to the Grove, and maybe even in the Pacific Northwest, where ministry does look a little bit different than other parts of the world. But where can people connect with you if they want to find the Grove, find you? I know you don't want to plug your stuff, but if they want to maybe see how a lunchtime live goes, or if they want to connect with you, the best spot to do that is where?
I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/james.carmichael.space.explorer. But I'm also on Instagram and Twitter as Jimmy Future.
Because of the audience that's listening to this, can you just quickly, and this might just be for me, so thank you for our listeners bearing with, can you just explain to everybody why your Facebook handle or your Facebook URL is that way?
You only get one shot. And a long time ago, you could pick it, right? And I was like, what if I ever go to space? I'm going to want this James Carmichael Space Explorer. Like that's, you only get one shot at that, and you don't want to be known for, like, once I go to space, I don't want to be known for anything else.
Yes.
And so that's kind of I'm staying in my lane, and just, also it's ridiculous. And that's my MO.
That's your MO on social media. That's right. So a pastor that has thought the ridiculous nature of social media for the longest time is now seeing lives come to know Jesus through this season of doing it online. So yeah, connect with James. Everything like that is in the show notes. As we wrap up, I would love it if you haven't already subscribed to this podcast, rate it and review it. It really helps these encouraging conversations. Apple and all the other podcast providers do the heavy lifting of spreading these good conversations to other people who need the encouragement. And until next time, everybody, my name's Aaron, and this is the Social Media Church Podcast.